Well, hello everybody. David Mitchell again, and welcome to the September edition of the Mayor's Monthly Video. Hope everybody had a wonderful and safe Labor Day. We ended the summer pretty hot, and hopefully we're getting into a cooling off period as fall and football season begins. So without further ado, let me get started. Real quick, should be a short session today. I want to talk to you about what's been going on, and we've spent the last several months, and we adopted recently our fiscal year 2024 budget. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that budget, give you an overview of it, what some of the major projects we've got on that budget. And then I didn't really have a formal citizen question and concern, but I did have a conversation with a citizen who had a question and concern. So I'm going to address that, and we'll go from there and call it a day. So the fiscal year 2024 budget was adopted by our City Council on September the 5th of this month. The fiscal year begins 1 October and runs through the 30th of September of 2024. So this year's budget, our estimated budget year receipts and carryover funds from the previous year is about $13.3 million. Now that's about $1 million less than last year. Last several years, we've had a significant amount of grant funding included in our budget. We spent some of that grant funding on various projects. So this year it's down about $1 million, not quite as much grant funding available. Budgeted expenses for the years just right at $12 million. Again, that's down a little bit from last year as far as expenses. Obviously, the revenues go down, the expenses go down. But also, the state legislature requires cities to appropriate funds for the operation of their various departments so that those expenses don't exceed 90% of their estimated revenues. So as you can see from this chart, ours is right there at about 89.8%. Within those expenses, there's a little over $2 million, almost $2.1 million of capital expenditures, and I'm going to talk about some of those in just a minute. So our net surplus, which is the amount between the revenue and expenses, not to exceed 90%, is $1.3 million. That's about the same as it was last year. What's better this year is our general refund reserves is much higher than it was last year. They're about $1.3 million. Now that's not in addition to that total net surplus. That is a part of the net surplus. But why it's good that surplus or those reserves are in the general fund is those funds are unrestricted and can be used for any purpose. Last year, about half of our reserves were in restricted funds. So if we had a unusual event, some of those funds we wouldn't have been able to access. So that's about 2.3 months of general fund operating expenses. The Government Finance Officers Association recommends that you have a minimum of 2 months. Some people recommend as much as 6 months. I don't know that Columbiana will ever get to that, but at least we're above the recommended minimum of 2 months at 2.3 months. So that's where we are as far as the budget. Some of those major projects, we've got all these various street paving projects. I'm not going to go through them in great detail. Goodwin Street, Collins Street, Lester Street, Hughes, Arlington, Sterrett, Jefferson, and Washington. And we're also going to pave the alley behind the west side of Main Street. We've got a major project going on. A lot of this is grant funding. It's the wastewater treatment plant renovation. That project has been going on for about 6 months or so. It's going to take probably about 2 years before it's totally completed. We sort of have to take one part of the treatment facility down while we work on another part and then bring it back up. So it's an incremental process there, but that's a huge project, and it's got about $2.5 million in the fiscal year 24 budget. And then we've got a storm drainage improvement project to deal with some flooding issues on Depot Street and West College Street. Again, that's funding that we got through ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act. That funding, that money has to be obligated in fiscal year 24. No later than the end of fiscal year 24, and it has to be spent no later than the end of fiscal year 26. So we are going to be obligating that money hopefully at our next council meeting. It's in the budget, but we will execute or get approval to execute the contract at our next council meeting. And then project will take about a year or so to complete. Some of the major capital expenses that we've got in the budget is we've got a fire truck in the budget. Our fleet of vehicles, we have a large fleet. They're a very good fleet, but they're an older fleet. And so some of the vehicles are getting costly to maintain, so we need to upgrade them. The fire truck is dependent upon getting an Assistance to Firefighters grant. We've got in our budget a new police car. Again, we sort of roll them off and bring on new ones incrementally. So we brought on, I think, one last year. We'll bring on a new one this year and roll an older one off. We need a new vehicle for our senior center. It's used a lot for delivering Meals on Wheels. We've been having to ask people to use their own vehicles because of the maintenance problems with the ones, so we put a new one in there. And then we've got a new public works facility that we made a commitment actually in 2021 when we refunded our debt to use the proceeds of that for the public works facility. We acquired some property. We've been doing some of the work ourselves, sort of a self-help project, if you will. We've now gotten to the state to where we're putting siding and roofing on the new warehouse facility. And when that's completed, we'll move out of the facility that's adjacent to the senior center, as well as the warehouse that's located on Mill Street downtown. So those are the major projects that we've got going on in 2024. So now let me tell you about what the question was in the conversation that I had with one of our residents. And the question deals with nuisance or damage caused by neighbors' trees. And the question was, can I trim a neighbor's trees that overhang into my yard? And the answer is yes, you can. But there's a caveat to it, like there is to everything. And I put on here, if you kill it, you buy it, but that's kind of simplistic terms. But the reality is it's a civil matter between you and your neighbor. You can trim the trees. It's best that you get permission, talk to your neighbor about that, or at least advise them. You don't necessarily need permission, but let them know that you're going to trim the tree limbs that overhang in your yard. But if subsequently the tree dies and it can be proven that it was because of damage that you did to the tree during your trimming, then you could be liable to replace that tree. But again, that would be a civil matter between you and your neighbor. So the next part of that question is, my neighbor liable for damage caused to my property by falling limbs from their tree? And the answer there is, like all legal answers, maybe. In order for the neighbor to be liable, is you would have to prove negligence on the neighbor's part. Did the neighbor absolutely know that the tree was dead and at risk of falling over onto your property, or limbs were at risk of falling on your property, and that they should have been able to do something about it? So again, that puts the burden of proof on you, but your neighbor may be liable for the damage caused to your property if you can prove that. And once again, it would be a civil matter between you and your neighbor. And then finally, is my neighbor responsible for debris like leaves and branches, etc., that fall from their trees and fall into your yard? And generally the answer there is no. Your neighbor is not responsible for what's considered natural events or acts of God. So if the wind blows and it blows the leaves in your yard, unfortunately, maybe a good neighbor might help you, but your neighbor is not responsible to clean up that. Likewise, if wind, storms, heavy rain breaks off branches and whatnot and twigs and things, and they fall in your yard, your neighbor is not responsible to clean that up. Again, those are considered natural events or acts of God. So that's kind of the way things go as far as nuisance or damage caused by neighbors' trees. I know I've had some issues myself. I'll also know that maybe I've been an issue myself, but I try to be a good neighbor. And when my trees, limbs are falling in my neighbor's yard, I try to clean them up, and same thing with the leaves and whatnot. But not everybody does that. So it'd be a better place if we all did that. So that's pretty much it for this month. It's kind of a short meeting. Next month, hope to have Chad Scroggins, who's our county manager, with us, and we'll talk about the relationship and how the city and the county collaborate with one another, hopefully to help you, the residents of Columbiana and the surrounding areas. So keep those cards and letters coming in, and we'll try to get those questions answered and get back to you. Have a great month.